Hello, I knew Peter Reyner Banham during the period from the mid to late 60s until his death. And I'm always interested in sort of what made Banham Banham. To me, an interesting fact is that he came from Norwich. He met his wife Mary, who'd come from London and was an art teacher in Norwich. And he met her after he had been in the Second World War, sent over to Bristol to be an aero engineer. I don't know at what level or precisely, but he often referred to this. The other thing I think is that Norwich is one of those places that has quite an intense culture, which is localized because it's the largest town until you get to London, which is more than 100 miles away. So it has that same characteristic as some of the French provincial cities, where there's a whole sort of tradition of music, of painting, of talking, of a certain kind of attitude towards, dare I say, culture. And in recent times, of course, literature. But Banham, it was also reported to me several times that he came from a very talkative family, that the whole Banham clan, as Mary used to say, the whole Banham clan talk the hinding off the donkey. They're good communicators. And she always implied that when he was young, he was something of a chatterbox. He certainly was had this almost schoolboy enthusiasm for certain things. And I think this shines through in his writing. And it comes through in his almost naughtily schoolboy delight at a certain time in digging out things that the normal design critics and architects would not consider to be proper things to talk about. I first knew him when he lived across the street from me in a place called Aberdare Gardens. Only 3 or 4 streets from where I now live. This is the red brick part of London, behind Swiss Cottage, down the hill from Swiss Cottage. And I knew about him. He had been actually on my final thesis jury at the AA, but was simply one of those people who occasionally came to the AA to give the odd lecture. He was basically a professor at Barbican. And he was a sort of person that you read about. And his book, Theory and Design in the First Machine Age, was probably the first book that I spent serious money buying after I graduated, came out short afterwards. So here we have a picture of the young Banham, reportedly talkative. The London Banham, riding his molten bicycle. And the Madder Market Theatre, where apparently he and Mary met when they were working, helping with making props and so on for the Madder Market Theatre, which is a particularly interesting, sort of eccentric, almost Elizabethan theatre in Norwich. And then the later Banham, of course, still with the version of the molten bicycle, but now on a salt flat in the USA. I want to dwell a little bit on his theory and design book, because I still go back to it. It was his PhD thesis as a student of Pevsner, and he put everything into that book. It's extremely researched. I think he learned some German in order to be able to read some of the original Blahrbook or whatever the hell, but he put everything into it. It's a difficult read. I've never, from then till now, and I've tried reading it 5 or 6 times and have had to talk about it in lectures, but it's heavy going. But it breaks down really incredibly well as a sort of grounding in the culture of 20th century architecture. The groupings of people are the writing is sometimes a bit turgid, and he becomes a much more fluent writer later. But he's very good at grouping together things, making them simple and clear for the young architect to understand where various different aspects and movements fit in with each other. Really is it, if you got your head around Banham or tried to, if you've read it 2 or 3 times, you really do have an amazing grounding from which to depart into whatever particular direction you wish to. And he has there are some marvelous quotes and categories and references. It's a brilliant book for reference. And here we see Banham in a rather interesting pose where he's, I think my picture's in the way, but I've moved it now. There you see Banham as the young sort of upstart establishment critic, glass of probably sherry in his hands, along with his mentor, Nicholas Pevsner, who after all was a German Jew who escaped to England and then became almost more anglicized than the English, and is also a referencing point for understanding the myriad of pieces of architecture all over the country. And John Summerson, who happened to be eventually the director of the Soane Museum and was my history lecturer, was the lecturer for my class when I moved to the AA. There he's very urbane, so you get this interesting mixture of the sort of raw ex-aircraft mechanic provincial, the emigre Jewish intellectual, and the very, very suave English and serious, also brilliantly witty writer about architecture. Actually, Summerson's books have a lot of gossip about the background to the buildings of the Renaissance and so on. And he also was interestingly a supporter of modernism, interestingly of a historian architect. He was involved with the Mars Group, which was a very avant-garde group of architects. So there he is. Banham has arrived, made his mark in London, and is standing slightly apart from the other 2 more establishment figures. But he had effectively joined the establishment. As soon as he really got his feet under the table, we see that a lot of his most important writing was for 2 weekly papers. The first was the New Statesman, which was a bit more raw than it is in today's New Statesman, and a very interesting follower were the articles that he then moved to New Society. And he was very close friends with the various editors of New Society. So we see a typical weekly piece where it says, this week, Reyner Banham on mock skeletons. Now, most sort of posh architectural critics don't talk about mock skeletons, nor do they necessarily talk about Barbarella, nor do they necessarily talk about sort of strange inventions of houses with the writer himself sitting in a sort of leotard or whatever he's sitting in. But at the same time, Banham was able to write very well and passionately about his friends, amongst whom are the Smithsons, and I'll come to that shortly. In fact, I come now back to the Aberdare Gardens flat, which was not exactly across the street from mine, but about 8 houses along, diagonally across. You could see his front room from mine if you looked out the window. And it was an amazing place. There had apparently been an earlier version of the Banham Friday evenings, which I was too young to go to, which apparently used to be held on Primrose Hill. But by the time his wife stopped my then wife in the street one day and said, we have people over on Fridays, would you like to come? It was after he'd started noticing Archigram and writing about it. But I used to see him go past on a cycle, but I was far too humble to sort of say hello at that point. Fast forward to when at last Hazel and I were allowed to be the youngest people invited to the regular Fridays. Cedric Price, I think, was the next youngest person. And they were extraordinary for the still only about two and a half years out of school guy, maybe 3 years out of school, not more. Suddenly, it came that the Banham Friday evenings were erratic. Sometimes they were just made up of locals. But the locals would include people like Richard Hamilton and Eduardo Palozzi, perhaps, and Frank Newby, the engineer who we see here, who was, of course, the other brains with Cedric behind the birdcage. Then became a very good friend. But it was at the Banham Friday evenings, you would occasionally get Mary phoning up and saying, Bucky's coming on Friday. And indeed, Buckminster Fuller was there. I think I met Bucky at least 3 times with all his London acolytes, who also were friends of Banham. But you would meet, and Hamilton, bottom left picture, there was a Hamilton on the wall, and Richard Hamilton's a very frequent Friday nighter, quite frequent with the Smithsons. And one of the most intriguing evenings was when the Smithsons and the Eameses were there at the same time, noticing the sort of things that they collected on their shelves are rather similar, but the personalities were totally, totally different. And then there were people like George Nelson, in fact, a big connection related to the Aspen design conferences, which the Banhams would go to. And on the back of that, most of the known designers, not only Nelson and the Eames, but even, interestingly, sometimes people from continental Europe, like Ian Shine, who we see with his plastic house here. I think Ian was there at least 2 times, to my knowledge. And Craig Elwood was a frequent visitor, which then links through to the whole West Coast LA thing. Already, Banham had stretched from just going to the Aspen Design Conference and somehow made his number with University of Southern California. At a certain point, once one had known him pretty well, and the embryo Archigram was starting to exist, we invented a bizarre event at Folkestone. And you can see from the poster that Banham is heavily featured. In fact, he was not only heavily featured on the poster, but he was very, very much a presence during the 2 days of this event, where we hoped that Fuller would come. He didn't come. We hoped that Iron Shine would come, but he didn't come. But Hans Hollein and Jelle Friedman and, of course, Cedric Price and a number of other people did come. And strangely enough, 600 people turned up, of whom 300 were crossing the channel, coming on bicycles and all sorts of things, and the other 300 came down from London. The point I'm making is that Banham was really up for these kinds of jamboree events, and he and Cedric actually, I think, made the event. And it was through Banham that one was alerted to Los Angeles. First of all, on his little Super 8 movies that he would make, and he would come back with these bits of Super 8 movie and show them to his Friday night friends. And I realized that both the contents of the Apologies book and of the film, really the dry run, the dummy run, were him talking to his friends on Friday nights. And we got sort of snippets of it, so that when the actual Los Angeles film did emerge, and when the book actually did emerge, one was in a way privileged enough to have heard the conversations and then enjoy the sort of tarted up or sort of professionalized, if you like, professionalized version of conversations. But the key thing, I think, for me in the embryo Archigram was information and kind of the kind of encouragement to go to Los Angeles that I think would have occurred from when Schindler and Neutra were encouraged to go to America. By Adolf Loos. But this was Banham encouraging one to take Los Angeles seriously. Issue of Los Angeles, that when one did eventually get to Los Angeles, it was interesting that you could see that he was already, by the time Ron Herron and I got there a little later, Banham was already very, very established with the Los Angeles scene. He was a good friend of Esther McCoy, who was their best local architectural writer. He was very close friends with John Entenza, who was the guy who, in fact, set up the program of houses that Eames and others did under the name Case Study Houses. And also, of course, Entenza was the editor of Arts and Architecture, so we see a typical couple of covers of Arts and Architecture. I think one designed by Ray Eames on the right, and the left-hand one showing Ray and Charles Eames with John Entenza. And bottom right picture is of the Lovell Beach House. I was privileged to go there with Banham. He took me along with Ron, and we saw the actual old couple of the Lovells, the famous curious Dr. Lovell and his wife, who were at that time looking pretty decrepit, and the house was reeking with damp and old sheets and stuff. It was quite intriguing. And the other thing is that contributing to some of the most interesting writing of Banham at the time was the Gamble House, because it was the Gamble House which was owned, I think, by then by the University of Southern California. So they used it as a guest house, and Banham would give a lot of descriptions of walking around the house at night and the creaking floorboards and so on. But back to his magazine articles too, the New Society, New Statesman articles, his enjoyment was such things. He would just often quote things like Formica or plastic fried eggs. He was fascinated by plastic objects. I don't know whether he used the famous plastic tomato, but if he didn't, he should have done. He was right into that kind of. And I remember very distinctly one article he wrote about was the Golden Egg Finchley Road. The Golden Egg Finchley Road is now a Chinese restaurant, but at that time it was a chain of pretty crappy restaurants called the Golden Egg, and he wrote a whole serious New Society article about the Golden Egg, probably getting up the bum of quite a lot of po-faced architects. So what the hell is he writing about? Or by that time they got used to his pushing of extending the culture. And another fascination of his was American cast style, particularly the period here in this example. And that leads to Banham as experience in LA. Now here's one of the sort of cultural tragedies. Banham so loved LA and was absolutely up for it, but he was never invited to do more than a month academically. He couldn't get a proper academic job at either USC, UCLA, or anywhere else that was Cal Arts. Though I think he would have really loved it. But nonetheless, as you know, and so it's this sort of person who, in a way, never quite became an accepted part of the establishment. Even when he was a full professor at Berkeley, he was treated as a sort of naughty boy. And I think he got fairly pissed off with some of the establishment there. I think if this can be extended as a conversation, it would be quite interesting. And Adrian Forty, I'm sure is listening and with you. I'm sorry, I can't be. I'm sure Adrian can extend all the background of that as one of Banham's proteges. But certainly when Ron and I were in Los Angeles, hanging out and teaching a bit at UCLA, the Ship's coffee shop was an exact extension. It was down the street from UCLA campus, not there any longer. And it was the prototypical Googie style Banham fave establishment, including the sort of atmosphere of the diner itself. It was the best of the diners, the most kind of out there manneristically of the diners. And well, Banham was, therefore, I seem to remember, pissed off with the Bartlett establishment or something. I say Adrian will help on this. And then he had an offer from somebody called Cohen, I think, who was the head of the New York University at Buffalo. And according to the Banhams, he was offered a really, really interesting job there. But when he got there, the money had dropped away and it wasn't such an interesting job after all. And Mary Banham hated it in Buffalo. He wrote some very interesting books because there was a marvelous industrial architecture there, but actually it was a nightmare for Mary, who had a wooden leg. In fact, Mary Banham's the only person who I'd ever met who gave a special party when she had had a wooden leg for 50 years. This is an extraordinary thing too. She lived into ripe old age, but she had this wooden leg for probably 60 years. And as I say, she celebrated. It's amazing getting this card saying a celebration on Friday or whatever it was of 50 years with wooden leg. She'd had some sort of gangrene just after her kids were born. And so going to Buffalo, which is sort of full of ice and snow a large part of the year, was an absolute operational nightmare. And with some relief, they went to Santa Cruz. I'll come to that in a moment. So Adrian, if you're there, I think this is a nice old stiff photograph of you. You also, in a funny way, your first famous book, Objects of Desire, takes off a little bit, perhaps in a more politically serious way than Banham's, about the objects that we use in everyday life and the culture of them. I then mentioned some of the other writer proteges of Banham, if I can call Jenks a protege, because there was one occasion when Peter Banham showed me his critic notes written in red ink of the unfinished Jenks thesis. It was very naughty, but he said, can I look at some of this stuff? And he was very, very waspish about Charlie Jenks. Jenks, who was a nice man actually, less so about Banham, but Banham sort of was, I think, irritated by Charlie Jenks. Another person who was a notable Banham protege, that's student, PhD student of, I think, was the Australian Sutherland Lyle, who I think still is somewhere in North London. And so the Banhams, then he didn't get an offer of anything in New York or in Los Angeles, but did get an offer to become a professor in the Department of Art, not architecture, but in the Department of Art at University of California, Santa Cruz, which I think from memory has several buildings by Charles Moore. But it's a nice place. It's not the most important of the University of California universities, but it's a nice place to be. It's benign, and you know, you could do worse. But something which I remember Mary pointing out to me, she said, really, Peter needs to be somewhere where there are people passing through. And the best will in the world, Santa Cruz is not where there's sort of quantity of interesting people passing through as there would be in either Los Angeles or London. And so at the very end of his life, he was finally given the job inherited from Henry Russell Hitchcock of professor at New York University, and had he lived, he would have gone there. And as is well known, he still wrote. When he was dying, he still wrote his acceptance speech of this chair. It meant a great deal to him that he had finally been accepted in a major city by a major university to inherit a very famous chair. So I went to stay with him both in Buffalo and in Santa Cruz, and was already beginning to sniff, beginning to just learn how all these academic hierarchies work, which is often quite viciously, and feeling, I wish Banham had really got into Los Angeles. There's a sort of parallel story that Colin Rowe, who didn't like Banham, but similarly, Colin Rowe, who was very known on another sort of set of grapevine, but never actually made it to teach in either Harvard or Yale. He was still out there at Cornell, which wasn't really his first choice. So these heavyweight characters who had great influence, many acolytes, often the really powerful academies are rather scared of them. I think they were scared of Rowe, they were scared of Banham in a different way. So here's Mary, who was a painter, had already lost her leg. This is a late photograph. She lost her leg years and years ago. It didn't seem to stop her getting around. She drove a car, she got to places, she was all over the world. She then did contribute to a certain number of exhibitions and catalogues, and she was not to be underestimated. The Banham Friday evenings were not just a sort of monologue by Peter Reyner Banham. They were very much influenced by Mary, who gave as good as she could get, and was very much a character in her own right. Though obviously Banham was more professional show-off, if you like. The book then, I've already explained, was really the product of his visits as an outsider and his there's a strong scholarliness of Banham when he stops just, teasing you with absurd examples. He really researches them. And I think the book is still an incredible reference, gone into many, many editions. I like the edition with the Hockney painting on it best. And the typical Googie architecture that was all over. So to return to this paradox of this person, first of all, to make it into the art history world, but then got to make it into the London sort of professorial establishment, and then dropped it all and made it as far as the desert. He was great at finding something. I think he survived because he could always find something to write about. He could always find something interesting to say about it, but one still feels that he was kept outside the core, certainly the academic establishment. His interest in the environment is well known, and of course most of the people he wrote about on either side of the Atlantic were friends of his. Rogers I don't think I ever saw Rogers at a Friday evening. Sterling would be there sometimes, and there's always an atmosphere. Sterling and the Smithsons were in the same room as each other. They really didn't want to know about each other, but their circles of friends overlap. But I think several of the Rogers acolytes were part of the same circuit. And finally, I'm of course interested in when one appears not just in being referred to. And Banham was a tremendous, I think this is well known, a tremendous supporter of the Archigram group. He was our supporter in print many, many times, though privately, he was the one person who would always be edging on to go further. He would not necessarily give you a rough time, but he was certainly critical. He'd say, come on, you could do better than that, apropos something. Or come on, why don't you try that? Or have you if you bother to read that, think he was really as the creative supporter, not just the sort of blind supporter. And so it is typical. I end on two Banham references. One is his issue of Design Quarterly, which came out of the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, mostly about Archigram things, with Ron's walking city on the cover. And Francois Dallegret. Francois Dallegret is basically a French artist, I think, graphic artist, who got into environmental things and was a very necessary draftsman for Banham's spoken ideas, probably the best. And it was also an amusing character in his own right. So this is my collective anecdote about Banham.